The Alpha King stands frozen outside an abandoned cabin, his centuries of control shattering as his mate's desperate voice carries on the wind, moaning his name in heat-induced need. She doesn't know he can hear her. She doesn't know he's her true mate, and he doesn't know she's about to change everything. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The rejection had happened 3 months ago, but Sarah Moonwhisper still felt the phantom ache of it in her chest, like a wound that refused to heal properly. She had been standing in the center of the Silverpine Pack's ceremonial grounds, wearing the traditional white dress that marked her as an Omega ready for bonding, her heart hammering with anticipation and nervousness as Callum Darkwater, the Pack's beta and her childhood friend, approached to complete their mating ceremony. Everyone had expected it. They had grown up together, trained together, and Callum had courted her properly for 2 full years. When he finally asked her to be his mate, Sarah had said yes without hesitation, believing that while it might not be the passionate, soul-deep connection of true mates, it would be good. They would be happy. She had been so incredibly wrong. Callum had walked up to her, looked into her eyes with something that might have been pity or regret or both, and said the words that shattered her entire world. "I cannot accept you as my mate. The bond I thought we had, the future I imagine, it isn't what I need. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve, and I realize now that I am not that wolf." "I'm sorry, Sarah." The rejection had hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over with pain as her Omega nature recoiled from the public refusal. But worse than the pain was the humiliation. Every member of the Silverpine Pack had witnessed her rejection, had seen her collapse to her knees in the ceremonial dress that suddenly felt like a mockery, had watched as pack healers rushed forward to help her through the worst of the rejection sickness that followed. For 2 weeks, Sarah had been bedridden, her body trying to process the trauma of rejected bonding. And when she finally recovered physically, she realized the emotional damage was far worse. The pitying looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the well-meaning pack members who tried to comfort her with platitudes about fate and timing. It was suffocating, so Sarah had made the hardest decision of her life. She packed her few belongings, left the only pack she had ever known, and became a rogue. For 3 months she had been traveling through neutral territories, taking odd jobs where she could, sleeping in whatever shelter she could find, and trying to rebuild some sense of self-worth that didn't depend on being chosen by someone else. It was during one of these jobs that she first saw him, the Alpha King. Sarah had been working in the kitchen of a way station that served as neutral ground for traveling wolves when the royal party arrived without warning. She had been carrying dishes from the kitchen when she glanced up and locked eyes with the most devastating male she had ever seen. Theron Nightshade, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, stood in the doorway of the way station like some kind of dark fantasy made flesh. He was tall, powerfully built, with midnight black hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense she had carefully constructed. But what struck Sarah most was the raw power that radiated from him in waves. This wasn't just an alpha. This was the Alpha, the one all others answered to, the king who had ruled for nearly 300 years. Their eyes met for just a moment, Sarah clutching her tray of dishes like a shield, Theron's gaze intense and searching. Then one of his advisors spoke to him, breaking the spell, and he looked away. Sarah fled back to the kitchen, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. She was just a rejected Omega working as a servant. He was a king. That moment of eye contact meant nothing, except her Omega nature, dormant and quiet since Callum's rejection, had stirred for the first time in months, and that terrified her. Sarah managed to avoid the royal party for the rest of their stay at the way station, keeping to the kitchen and the servants' quarters. But She couldn't stop thinking about those intense eyes, that overwhelming presence, the way her entire body had responded to a single glance. It's just because he's a powerful alpha, Sarah told herself firmly. Your omega nature is responding to his dominance. It doesn't mean anything. Except she had been around powerful alphas her entire life, including her former Pax Alpha and Callum himself, and none of them had ever made her feel like that. None of them had made her want to submit and surrender and offer herself up with just one look. 2 days after the royal party left the way station, Sarah's heat hit. She had been walking through a neutral forest, heading toward the next settlement where she hoped to find work, when the first wave of it struck without warning. Omegas typically had heats every few months, predictable cycles that could be managed with preparation and privacy. But this was different. This was intense, overwhelming, and at least a week early according to her normal schedule. Sarah barely made it to an abandoned hunter's cabin she spotted through the trees before the second wave hit. Dropping her to her knees with its intensity, she crawled through the door, managed to get it closed and barred, and collapsed on the dusty floor as her body burned with need. This wasn't a normal heat. This felt like something triggered, something desperate, something that demanded to be satisfied in ways that terrified her. The first night was torture. Sarah's body ached, empty, and needing, her skin hypersensitive to even the lightest touch of her own clothing. She tried to ignore it, tried to wait it out like she had with previous heats, but this one wouldn't be denied. By the second hour, she found her hands moving of their own accord, seeking relief from the overwhelming sensations. She thought of nothing in particular at first, just focused on the physical sensations, trying to ease the burning need, but then her traitorous mind conjured up an image: dark hair, intense eyes, power and dominance and strength, the Alpha King. Sarah's eyes flew open in horror, but her body didn't stop. Her omega nature had latched onto Theron Nightshade as the ideal alpha, and now it was demanding she imagine him, picture him, pretend it was his hands touching her instead of her own. No, Sarah whispered to the empty cabin, but her protest was weak. This is wrong. He's the king. He doesn't even know my name. But her omega nature didn't care about logic or appropriateness or the vast chasm between their stations. It only cared that she had seen her ideal mate, and now it wanted him with a desperation that bordered on madness. Her hands continued their work, and Sarah found herself imagining scenarios she had no business thinking about. Theron, finding her in this cabin, his eyes dark with desire as he realized she was in heat. Theron crossing the room with predatory grace, caging her against the wall with his powerful body. Theron's hands replacing her own, knowing exactly how to touch her, how to satisfy needs she didn't fully understand herself. Theron, she heard herself whimper, and the sound of his name on her lips sent a shock of sensation through her entire body. Please. She hated herself for it, hated how weak and desperate it made her feel, but she couldn't stop. The images kept coming, vivid and detailed, Theron kissing her like she was precious and necessary, his hands exploring every inch of her heated skin, Theron's voice deep and commanding, telling her she was beautiful, desired, chosen, Theron claiming her as his, making her his mate, his omega, his everything. Alpha King, Sarah gasped, her body arching off the floor as sensation built toward an inevitable peak. Theron, please, I need. Her own voice shocked her back to reality just as release washed over her in overwhelming waves. For a few blissful moments, the burning need subsided, and Sarah lay on the dusty floor, trembling and trying to catch her breath. Then shame crashed over her like cold water. She had just touched herself while moaning the name of the Alpha King, fantasizing about a male so far above her station that the very idea was laughable. What was wrong with her? Was she really so desperate for validation after Callum's rejection that she had latched on to the first powerful alpha she saw? The relief lasted maybe an hour before the need came roaring back, worse than before. Sarah's heat was escalating, and she realized with growing horror that she was facing at least 3 more days of this. 3 days of burning, aching, needing, 3 days of seeking relief, while her traitorous mind conjured up images of a king she had seen for mere seconds. 3 days of whimpering his name into the darkness of an abandoned cabin and hating herself for it. By the second day, Sarah was barely coherent. Heat had consumed her completely, reducing her to a creature of pure need and sensation. She had given up fighting the fantasies, had surrendered to imagining Theron in vivid, desperate detail. Sometimes she pictured him finding her in the cabin, his eyes blazing with possessive hunger as he scented her heat. Sometimes she imagined meeting him in different circumstances, being someone worthy of his attention, having him choose her the way Callum never had. Sometimes she just focused on the physical, on imagining his hands, his mouth, his body against hers. And through it all, she couldn't stop saying his name, Theron, Alpha King. Please, I need you. Choose me, want me. The words spilled from her lips in an endless litany of desperate need, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah was grateful she was alone. If anyone heard her like this, heard her begging for the attention of a king who didn't know she existed, the humiliation would destroy her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Theron Nightshade had ordered his personal guard to track her after their brief encounter at the way station. What she didn't know was that he had felt something in that moment their eyes met, something his ancient alpha nature recognized even if his conscious mind was still processing it. What she didn't know was that he had sent his most trusted wolves to quietly follow her, to ensure her safety without interfering with her journey, reporting back on her location and well-being. And what she absolutely didn't know was that Theron himself was currently less than a mile from the cabin where she lay lost in heat-induced fantasies about him. He had been on his way to a summit with the Eastern Territories when the report came through. The Omega from the way station, the one who had made his alpha nature surge with recognition, had gone into heat and taken shelter in an abandoned cabin. She appeared to be alone, unprotected, vulnerable. Every instinct Theron possessed screamed at him to go to her, but he forced himself to pause, to think rationally. He was the Alpha King. He couldn't just appear at some random Omega's heat cabin like a young alpha with no control. It would be inappropriate, possibly frightening to her, and certainly fodder for gossip that could damage both their reputations. But his wolf wouldn't be denied. The primal part of him that had recognized something essential in that brief glance at the way station was howling at him to move, to claim, to protect what was his. Theron had lived for nearly 300 years. He had been Alpha King for 2.5 centuries, had fought countless battles, made impossible decisions, carried the weight of his entire species on his shoulders. In all that time, he had never once felt the mate bond form. He had begun to believe he never would, that perhaps as punishment for the violence of his youth, or simply as cosmic irony, he would rule alone forever. And then he had walked into a way station and locked eyes with a common Omega carrying dirty dishes, and his entire world had tilted on its axis. The mate bond had formed instantly, powerfully, undeniably. Every cell in his body had recognized her as his Omega, his mate, his queen. And judging by the way she had fled back to the kitchen, she had felt absolutely nothing beyond perhaps intimidation at his presence. Theron had tried to be rational about it. Just because the mate bond had formed for him didn't mean it had formed for her. Sometimes bonds were one-sided, particularly if one party was already emotionally attached to someone else. He had discreetly inquired about her with the way station's owner, learning that she was a rogue Omega named Sarah, who had been rejected by her previous intended mate and was traveling alone. The rejection explained why she might not feel the bond yet. Rejection sickness could sometimes delay or suppress mate bond recognition. Theron had decided to give her time, to have her quietly watched and protected while she processed her recent trauma, and to approach her eventually when she might be more receptive. That plan had lasted exactly until he learned she was in heat and alone. Now, as Theron stood in the forest less than a mile from Sarah's cabin, his legendary control was hanging by a thread. He could scent her on the wind, sweet and desperate, and his alpha nature was demanding he go to her immediately. "You cannot simply appear at her cabin," his beta Marcus said quietly beside him. "My king, she doesn't know you. She'll be terrified. She's in heat and unprotected in neutral territory." Theron growled, his eyes fixed in the direction of the cabin. "Any rogue alpha could scent her and decide to take what they want." "Then we position guards around the perimeter," Marcus suggested reasonably. "We protect her without interfering. You cannot go to her yourself, not like this." "Why not?" Theron demanded, his alpha dominance bleeding into his voice and making Marcus flinch slightly. "Because she is your mate," Marcus said carefully. And if you go to her while she is in heat, and you are barely controlling your alpha nature, you will do something you will both regret. You will claim her without her consent, without her even knowing who you are or what it means. Is that how you want your mate to meet you, my king, with you out of control and her unable to refuse?" The words were like cold water, shocking Theron back to rationality. Marcus was right. Going to Sarah now, when she was vulnerable and he was barely controlling his most primal instincts, would be a violation. It would be taking advantage of her heat-addled state to satisfy his own need to claim her, and that was not the male he wanted to be, especially not for his mate. "Position guards around the cabin," Theron ordered, his voice rough with the effort of control. "No one gets near her, and I want reports every hour on her condition." Marcus bowed and moved to follow the orders, leaving Theron standing in the forest, every muscle in his body coiled with the need to go to his mate. He could hear her now, faintly on the wind. Small sounds of distress that made his alpha nature rage against his control, and then, carried on a shift in the breeze, he heard something that made him freeze completely. "Theron." It was barely a whisper, desperate and needy, but unmistakable. She was saying his name. "Please, Alpha King, need you." Theron's control nearly shattered. His mate, lost in the throes of heat, was calling for him specifically. How was that possible? They had shared one brief glance. She couldn't possibly be thinking of him unless, on some level, her Omega nature had recognized the bond even if her conscious mind hadn't. Unless she was as drawn to him as he was to her, even without understanding why. "Theron," came her voice again, clearer this time, and he realized with shock that he had unconsciously moved closer to the cabin. "Choose me. Want me. Please." The desperation in her voice nearly destroyed him. Here was his mate, alone and vulnerable, calling for him with a need that matched his own, and honor and propriety demanded he stay away. It was torture worse than any battle wound he had ever endured. Marcus appeared beside him again, his expression concerned. "My king, you need to leave this area. Being this close when she is calling for you, it is too much. Your control will not hold." "I am not some young alpha who cannot control my base instincts," Theron snapped, but even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "With respect," Marcus said quietly, "when it comes to your mate, you are exactly that. We all are. The mate bond strips away centuries of control and reduces us to our most primal selves. There is no shame in it, my king. But there is danger in denying it. You need to distance yourself until her heat passes. Only then can you approach her properly. Theron knew Marcus was right, but leaving felt impossible. Every step away from the cabin would be agony, knowing his mate was alone and calling for him. But every step closer would weaken his control, bringing him nearer to doing something unforgivable. How long? Theron forced himself to ask, how long does she have left? Based on the intensity of her scent, Marcus said carefully, at least 2 more days, possibly 3. Can you maintain control for that long while this close? No, Theron admitted, the word tasting like ash. No, I cannot. Then we need to leave, Marcus said gently. Trust me to coordinate the guards. Trust that she will be protected. And trust that when her heat passes, you will have the opportunity to meet her properly, as she deserves. Theron stood frozen, torn between duty and desire, between what he wanted and what was right. Then Sarah's voice came again on the wind, broken and desperate, moaning his name like a prayer, and he knew he had reached his limit. If I hear her calling for me like that one more time, Theron said quietly, his voice rough with strain, I will go to her. Consequences be damned. Then let us leave immediately, Marcus urged, before that happens. The journey back to his royal convoy was the longest of Theron's life. Every step away from Sarah felt wrong, like he was abandoning his mate when she needed him most. But he forced himself to continue, to put distance between them, because the alternative was unthinkable. He spent the next 3 days in a state of barely controlled rage, snapping at advisors, unable to focus on matters of state, counting down the hours until Marcus's reports indicated Sarah's heat had passed. The guards around her cabin reported no incidents, no rogue alphas attempting to approach, no danger beyond the Omega suffering through her heat cycle alone. Each report should have eased Theron's mind, but instead only made him more desperate to go to her. Finally, on the 4th day, Marcus appeared with news that Sarah's heat had passed and she had left the cabin appearing weak but recovered. She was heading toward the western settlements, likely looking for work. Now, Theron said immediately, now I can go to her. Marcus opened his mouth, clearly about to suggest a more planned approach, but Theron's expression stopped him. You have waited 3 days with more control than most alphas could manage, Marcus said instead. Very well, my king. How do you wish to approach this? Carefully, Theron replied. She doesn't know about the mate bond. She doesn't know I've been having her protected. From her perspective, I am a king she glimpsed briefly at a way station, and nothing more. We need to engineer a meeting that appears natural. Then, may I suggest, Marcus said thoughtfully, that we happen upon her on the road? A chance encounter. You can offer assistance to a traveling Omega as any honorable Alpha would. It gives you an opportunity to speak with her, to begin building a connection without overwhelming her with truth she isn't ready to hear. Theron considered this, then nodded slowly. That could work. But what reason would I have for being on this particular road? We were traveling to the Eastern Summit, Marcus pointed out. This is a reasonable route. We simply encountered a rogue Omega who appeared to need assistance. Nothing unusual about that. There was nothing unusual about it except for the fact that Theron's entire being was focused on this meeting with an intensity he had never felt for anything in his long life, except for the fact that his mate had spent days in heat, moaning his name, calling for him, needing him, and had no idea he knew, except for the fact that he was about to come face to face with the one being in the entire world who could bring the fearsome Alpha King to his knees. They found Sarah 2 hours later, walking along a forest road, a small pack on her back, and exhaustion evident in every line of her body. She looked thin, like she hadn't been eating properly, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But she was beautiful, so beautiful that Theron's breath caught at the sight of her. When she noticed their approach, Sarah moved quickly to the side of the road, lowering her eyes in the submissive gesture expected from an Omega encountering an Alpha party. Theron wanted to tell her she never had to submit to him, that she was his equal, his mate, his queen, but that conversation would have to wait. The carriage slowed, and Theron climbed out, approaching Sarah with careful, non-threatening movements. "Are you well, Omega?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Do you require assistance?" Sarah kept her eyes down, but he saw her hands trembling slightly as they gripped the straps of her pack. "I am well, Alpha. Thank you for your concern. I merely travel to the next settlement. Your scent indicates recent heat sickness," Theron observed, and saw her flinch at his directness. "Did you have adequate shelter? Were you safe?" "Yes, Alpha," Sarah said quietly, and Theron heard the lie in her voice. She clearly didn't consider suffering through heat alone in an abandoned cabin to be adequate shelter or safety. "Look at me," Theron said softly, and after a moment of hesitation, Sarah slowly raised her eyes to his. The impact of meeting her gaze fully for only the second time nearly staggered him. His mate, beautiful and broken, and so much stronger than she knew. "What is your name, Sarah Moon Whisper, Alpha?" she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "And where is your pack, Sarah Moon Whisper?" "I have none, Alpha. I am rogue, by choice or by circumstance." "Does it matter?" Sarah asked, and there was the slightest edge to her voice that made Theron want to smile. His mate had spirit beneath that submissive exterior. "It matters," Theron said carefully, "because if you are rogue by circumstance, perhaps that circumstance can be changed." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and he saw hope flash across her face before she quickly suppressed it. "I was rejected by my intended mate," she said, her voice flat and emotionless, in the way that suggested old pain. "I chose to leave my former pack rather than remain as an object of pity." "That is understandable," Theron replied, "and brave. Not many Omegas have the courage to walk away from everything they know." "I had nothing left to lose," Sarah said simply. "That is where you are wrong," Theron said quietly, holding her gaze. "You have yourself, your strength, your future. Those are not nothing." Sarah stared at him like he had said something profound, and Theron realized that no one had spoken to her like this in a very long time, perhaps ever. "Will you travel with us to the next settlement?" Theron offered. "The roads can be dangerous for those traveling alone. Your safety would be assured in our company." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between desire for safety and fear of appearing presumptuous. "Alpha, I couldn't possibly impose on your generosity." "You are not imposing," Theron assured her. "I am offering. Will you accept?" After a long moment, Sarah nodded slowly. "Thank you, Alpha. Your kindness is more than I deserve. You deserve far more than you know," Theron said softly, then gestured toward the carriage. "Come, let us see you safely to your destination." As Sarah climbed into the carriage, moving with obvious exhaustion, Theron caught Marcus's knowing look. His beta recognized that this was only the beginning, that the Alpha King had found his mate and would not rest until she understood her own worth. But for now, Theron simply climbed into the carriage beside Sarah, close enough to scent her, to feel the mate bond humming between them, to begin the slow process of showing her that she was not rejected, not worthless, not unwanted. What Sarah didn't know yet was that the king she had unknowingly called for during her heat had come for her. That the Alpha her Omega nature had recognized even when her mind hadn't, was sitting beside her, already planning how to court her properly, how to help her heal from rejection, how to show her she was chosen. And what Theron didn't know yet was that Sarah remembered every desperate moment of her heat, every fantasy, every time she had moaned his name. And sitting beside him now, breathing in his scent, feeling safe for the first time in months, she was terrified he would somehow discover her shameful secret. The carriage was luxurious, in a way Sarah had never experienced, with soft velvet seats and cushions that seemed designed for comfort rather than mere function. She sat as far to one side as possible, trying to maintain appropriate distance from the Alpha King, trying not to be obvious about the way her entire body was hyper-aware of his presence. Theron sat across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel too warm. Marcus, his beta, sat beside him, maintaining a respectful silence that somehow felt more comfortable than intrusive. "How long have you been traveling alone?" Theron asked after a few moments, his voice gentle in a way that seemed at odds with his overwhelming presence. 3 months, Alpha," Sarah answered, keeping her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap, "since shortly after my rejection. And in those 3 months, have you found any packs willing to take in a rogue Omega?" Theron continued, and Sarah couldn't tell if there was judgment in his voice or simple curiosity. "I haven't looked, Alpha," she admitted quietly. "I'm not ready to join another pack, to risk that kind of rejection again. So instead, you wander alone, taking odd jobs, risking your safety," Theron said, and now there was definitely something in his voice, an emotion that Sarah couldn't quite identify. That seems like a high price to pay for pride. "It's not pride, Alpha," Sarah said, and felt a flash of defensive anger give her courage to meet his eyes. "It's self-preservation. Every pack I join would know I was rejected. They would wonder what was wrong with me, why I wasn't good enough. The whispers, the pity, the constant reminders that I failed at the one thing Omegas are supposed to be good at. I'd rather be alone than live like that." "You didn't fail," Theron said quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You were failed by someone who didn't recognize your worth. There's a difference." "Easy for an Alpha King to say," Sarah replied before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted her boldness. "Forgive me, Alpha. I spoke out of turn." "No," Theron said, and there was something almost like approval in his voice. "Don't apologize for speaking truth. You're right that I cannot fully understand your experience, but I have lived long enough to recognize strength when I see it, and you, Sarah Moonwhisper, are far stronger than you give yourself credit for." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes and quickly looked away, not wanting him to see how his words affected her. When was the last time someone had called her strong? When was the last time anyone had suggested she had worth beyond her ability to bond with a mate? "Are you hungry?" Theron asked, changing the subject with what seemed like deliberate kindness. "You look as though you haven't eaten properly in some time." "I manage," Sarah said, though her stomach betrayed her by growling softly at the mere mention of food. "Marcus," Theron said without taking his eyes off Sarah, "please have the driver stop at the next way station. We'll take a meal before continuing." "That's not necessary, Alpha," Sarah protested weakly. "I don't want to delay your journey." "Oh, our journey can afford a delay," Theron replied firmly. "Your well-being cannot." The way station they stopped at was busy with travelers, and Sarah felt self-conscious as she entered beside the Alpha King and his beta. People noticed them immediately, conversations faltering as they recognized Theron, wolves lowering their eyes in respect or submission. Sarah tried to make herself small, to fade into the background, but Theron's hand came to rest lightly on the small of her back, guiding her forward with a possessiveness that made her Omega nature sing, even as her mind questioned what it meant. He guided her to a private dining area, away from the curious eyes of other travelers, and waited until she was seated before taking his own seat. A server appeared almost immediately, clearly nervous about serving royalty, and Theron ordered enough food for several people. When the server left, Sarah found herself alone with Theron and Marcus, the silence stretching between them. "Tell me about your pack," Theron said finally, "the one you left. What was it like growing up there?" It was like any pack, Sarah said with a shrug, trying to sound casual. Hierarchies in politics, and everyone knowing everyone else's business. I was born there, raised there, expected to mate there and die. There. It sounds stifling, Theron observed. It was all I knew, Sarah replied, until it wasn't enough anymore, or until it made clear I wasn't enough for it. The food arrived, and Sarah tried not to appear too eager as she began eating, but she was hungrier than she had realized, and the quality of the food was far better than anything she had eaten in months. Theron watched her with an expression she couldn't interpret, something between satisfaction and concern. "When was your last proper meal?" he asked quietly. "I don't remember," Sarah admitted, then added defensively, "I've been managing fine." "You've been surviving," Theron corrected. "That's not the same as being fine." Sarah wanted to argue, but she was too busy eating to form a coherent response. And if she was honest with herself, he was right. She had been surviving, nothing more, and barely that. "Why do you care?" Sarah asked finally, setting down her fork and meeting Theron's gaze directly. "I'm nobody, just a rejected rogue Omega you happen to encounter on the road. Why waste your time and resources on someone like me?" "Because you matter," Theron said simply, his voice carrying a weight of conviction that made Sarah's breath catch. "Because every wolf deserves basic dignity and care, regardless of their station or their past. And because there is something about you, Sarah Moonwhisper, that my instincts tell me is worth knowing better." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt her Omega nature respond to his words with a surge of longing that terrified her. This was dangerous. She couldn't allow herself to develop feelings for the Alpha King, couldn't let herself hope for something so far beyond her reach. That path led only to more heartbreak. "I appreciate your kindness, Alpha," Sarah said carefully, trying to rebuild her defenses. "But I don't want you to feel obligated to help me beyond seeing me safely to the next settlement. After that, I'll be fine on my own." "And if I want to help you beyond that?" Theron asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "What then?" "Then I would have to wonder what you want in return," Sarah replied honestly. "In my experience, powerful wolves don't offer help without expecting something back." "A fair assessment," Theron acknowledged, "but incorrect in this case. I want nothing from you except the opportunity to know you better, to understand the wolf behind those carefully constructed walls you hide behind, and perhaps, eventually, to see you smile without sadness lurking in your eyes." Sarah stared at him, speechless. No one had ever spoken to her like this, had ever suggested that knowing her was valuable in itself rather than for what she could provide. It was overwhelming and terrifying and made her want things she had no business wanting. The Alpha King was being kind to a rogue Omega out of the goodness of his heart. That was all this was. It couldn't be anything more, except her Omega nature whispered otherwise, reminded her of the desperate hours in that cabin when she had called his name, when her body had recognized something her mind still couldn't accept: the mate bond. Was it possible? Could the bond she had felt forming in those fever-bright moments of heat actually be real? No, Sarah shut down that thought immediately. The mate bond was rare, and it certainly didn't form between kings and rejected rogues. She had been heat-addled and desperate, and her Omega nature had latched onto the first powerful alpha she had seen. That was all. It had to be all, because the alternative, that the Alpha King might actually be her true mate, was too impossibly perfect to ever be real. And Sarah had learned the hard way that when something seemed too good to be true, it always was. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, though Sarah was hyper-aware of every glance Theron sent her way, every small gesture that suggested care rather than obligation. When they returned to the carriage, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "The settlement we're heading to," Theron said, as they resumed their journey. It's one of the larger neutral territories. You should be able to find work there easily. What kind of work are you looking for? Anything honest, Sarah replied. I've done kitchen work, cleaning, some textile work. I'm not particular as long as it provides shelter and meals. Those are limited ambitions for someone with your intelligence, Theron observed. Have you never wanted more? Wanting more is a luxury for wolves who have options, Sarah said quietly. I'm just trying to survive. But what if you had options? Theron pressed gently. What would you want then? Sarah looked out the carriage window, watching the landscape pass by as she considered the question. No one had asked her what she wanted in so long that she had almost forgotten how to dream. A place to belong, she said finally. Not just a pack that tolerates me or takes me in out of obligation, but somewhere I actually fit, somewhere my presence matters. People who see me as valuable, not despite being an omega, but as a whole person, the freedom to make my own choices without constantly worrying about survival. And maybe, she paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, someone who chooses me. Not because they have to, not because of duty or politics or convenience, but because they actually want me. All of that is possible, Theron said softly. All of that is within reach. Not for someone like me, Sarah replied with a sad smile. Those are dreams for wolves with better prospects. I'm a rejected rogue omega, alpha. My prospects begin and end with finding my next meal and shelter. What if I told you I could offer you all of those things? Theron said, and Sarah's head snapped toward him in shock. What if I told you that you could have a place in the royal court, a position of value and respect, the security to never worry about survival again, and the freedom to make your own choices? Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding. Why would you offer that? What would you want in return? The truth, Theron said quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The truth is that when I saw you at that way station weeks ago, something happened, something I had stopped believing was possible after 3 centuries of searching. Sarah felt her breath catch, felt her omega nature surge with recognition even as her mind tried to reject what he was implying. No, she whispered, that's not possible. The mate bond doesn't form between a king and a rogue. Theron finished for her. Why not? Do you think the moon goddess cares about titles and stations? The bond forms where it will, Sarah, and it formed for me the moment I saw you. Sarah shook her head, backing away as much as the confines of the carriage would allow. You're mistaken. I would have felt it too. The bond is supposed to be mutual. It is mutual, Theron said gently, but rejection sickness can sometimes delay or suppress bond recognition. Tell me honestly, Sarah, when you were in heat, did you think of anyone? Sarah felt her face flame with humiliation, felt panic spike through her chest. How could he possibly know? I don't, she stammered, unable to meet his eyes. That's not. You called my name, Theron said softly, and Sarah felt her world tilt. I was close enough to hear you, close enough to know that your omega nature recognized the bond even if your conscious mind couldn't accept it yet. You called for me, Sarah. You needed me. And it took every ounce of control I possessed not to go to you. The shame was overwhelming. He knew. He had heard her desperate, pathetic pleas, heard her moaning his name like some lovesick fool. Sarah wanted to throw herself from the moving carriage, wanted to disappear, wanted to be anywhere but trapped in this confined space with the male who now knew her most humiliating secret. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I couldn't control it. I was heat-addled and desperate, and my omega nature just latched on to you because you're powerful. And I'm broken. And Sarah, Theron interrupted firmly, and when she didn't look up, he moved across the carriage to sit beside her. Sarah, look at me. Please. Slowly, reluctantly, Sarah raised her tear-filled eyes to his. You have nothing to apologize for, Theron said, his voice gentle but intense. Nothing? Your Omega nature recognized your true mate? There is no shame in that. The only shame would be mine, for not being strong enough to go to you when you needed me, for making you suffer through your heat alone, because I was too concerned with propriety and your consent to claim what my alpha nature was screaming for. But I don't understand, Sarah said, her voice breaking. You're the Alpha King. You could have anyone. Why would the bond form with someone like me, someone rejected and worthless, and... You are not worthless, Theron said fiercely, his hands coming up to frame her face, forcing her to hold his gaze. You are not worthless, Sarah. You are my mate. You are the one wolf in all the world who was made for me, who I was made for. And yes, I could have had many wolves over the centuries. I've been propositioned, courted, pursued by alphas and omegas who wanted to be queen. But none of them were you. None of them made my soul recognize its other half. None of them were chosen for me by the moon goddess herself. Sarah felt more tears fall, felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling under the weight of his words. But Callum rejected me. If I was good enough to be someone's mate, why would he reject me? Because he wasn't your true mate, Theron said gently. The bond you would have formed with him would have been a choice bond, made through will and commitment rather than destiny. Those bonds can be strong, but they can also be rejected if one party decides they don't want it. The true mate bond cannot be rejected, Sarah. It exists whether we want it to or not. And I have wanted nothing more than to find my true mate for 300 years. Sarah searched his eyes, looking for any sign of deception or obligation, but found only sincerity and something that looked almost like desperation. He's telling the truth, her Omega nature whispered. He's ours. Claim him, accept him, choose him. But her mind, scarred by rejection and months of survival, couldn't accept it so easily. What if you're wrong, Sarah whispered. What if this isn't the true mate bond? What if it's just attraction or... Sarah, Theron said quietly, do you know what the true mate bond feels like? She shook her head. I've never experienced it. Then let me show you, he said softly. May I? Sarah didn't know what he was asking permission for, but she found herself nodding anyway. Theron's hands slid from her face to her shoulders, then down her arms until he was holding both her hands in his. Then he closed his eyes and seemed to concentrate. Suddenly Sarah felt it, a warmth that started where their hands connected and spread through her entire body like golden light. It was different from the burning need of heat, different from simple attraction. This was recognition, soul deep and undeniable. This was completion, like finding a part of herself she hadn't known was missing. This was home. The mate bond blazed to life between them with an intensity that made Sarah gasp. She could feel Theron's emotions through it, his relief and joy and fierce protectiveness, his desire tempered by patient control, his absolute certainty that she was his and he was hers. And underneath it all, the primal alpha claim, mine, mine, mine. Oh, Sarah breathed, tears flowing freely now. Oh, goddess. Now do you believe me? Theron asked gently, and Sarah could hear the vulnerability in his voice, the fear that even now she might reject what was undeniable. I feel it, Sarah whispered. I feel you. It's real. It's real, Theron confirmed, and the relief in his voice was palpable. You are my mate, Sarah, my true mate, the one I've been searching for across centuries. And if you'll have me, if you'll accept this bond, I swear to you that you will never feel rejected or worthless or alone again. But Sarah's mind was still catching up to her heart. I'm nobody, she said again, desperately trying to make him understand. I'm a rogue Omega with no family, no prospects, no training in how to be a queen. I don't know anything about politics or court life or how to rule. I'll fail you. I'll embarrass you. Everyone will wonder why the great Alpha King ended up with someone so far beneath him. Then they can wonder, Theron said firmly. I don't care what anyone thinks, Sarah. I care about you. And you won't be alone in this. I will teach you everything you need to know. My court will support you. And if anyone dares to suggest you are beneath me, they will learn very quickly that insulting my mate is insulting me. Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to surrender to the bond and let herself have this impossible dream. But fear held her back. The fear that this was too good to be true, that something would go wrong, that she would wake up and discover it was all a heat-fevered fantasy. I'm scared, Sarah admitted in a small voice. I'm so scared of believing this, and then losing it, of failing you or disappointing you or not being enough. Then we'll be scared together, Theron said gently, because I'm terrified too, Sarah. Terrified that you'll reject the bond out of fear. Terrified that I'll fail to make you happy, that I'll push too hard or not hard enough. Terrified that after 300 years of searching, I'll somehow lose you before I've barely found you. You're scared? Sarah asked in disbelief. But you're the Alpha King. I'm also just a male who has finally found his mate and is desperately hoping she'll choose him back, Theron said with a slight smile. The title doesn't make me immune to fear, Sarah. It just means I have more practice hiding it. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, felt some of her fear ease at the knowledge that he was vulnerable too. This wasn't a powerful king offering charity to a pitiful rogue. This was two wolves who had found each other against impossible odds, both scared and hopeful, and trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between them. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. Now, Theron said, that depends on you. The bond exists whether you accept it or not. But I won't force you into anything you're not ready for. If you need time to process this, to decide if you want to accept the bond and everything that comes with it, I'll wait. If you want to continue to the settlement and think about it alone, I'll escort you there and give you space. Or, he paused, his eyes searching hers, if you want to come with me to the palace, to see what your life could be like, to give us a chance to know each other properly before making any final decisions, that option is open to you as well. What would you prefer? Sarah asked. Honestly, Theron's grip on her hands tightened slightly. I want you to come with me. I want to court you properly, to show you that you are valued and cherished and desired. I want time to prove that I can be the mate you deserve. But more than any of that, I want you to choose what feels right for you, even if it's not what I want. Sarah took a shaky breath, feeling the mate bond humming between them, warm and insistent. Her Omega nature was screaming at her to accept, to go with him, to claim her mate, and never let go. But her scarred heart needed more reassurance. If I come with you, she said slowly, would I be able to leave if I wanted to? If I decided this was too much, or I wasn't ready, would you let me go? Theron was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could feel the war within him through the bond, his alpha nature raging against the very idea of letting her leave, while his rational mind recognized her need for that assurance. Yes, he said finally, though the words seemed to pain him. If you wanted to leave, I would not stop you. The bond would make it agonizing for both of us, but your freedom to choose is more important than my need to keep you close. I would ask that you give me a fair chance first, that you try to see if this could work, before deciding it can't. But ultimately, Sarah, you are not a prisoner. You have never been, and will never be a prisoner. That honest answer, the pain it clearly caused him to offer her an escape, did more to reassure Sarah than any flowery promises could have. He meant it. Even though it would hurt him, even though his alpha nature was probably howling in protest, he would let her go if she asked. She would never have to ask. Then I'll come with you, Sarah said quietly, and watched relief flood Theron's face. I'll come to the palace and give this a chance. Give us a chance. But I need you to be patient with me. I need time to heal from my rejection, to learn who I am beyond someone's failed bond. I need to trust that this is real and not just going to be taken away from me. I can be patient, Theron promised. We'll go at whatever pace you need. No pressure, no expectations beyond what you're ready to give. We'll spend time together, get to know each other, and let the bond develop naturally. Sarah nodded, feeling a fragile hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Then she remembered something and felt panic spike through her again. The court, she said urgently. What will they think when you bring home a rogue Omega? What will they say? They will say that their king has found his true mate, and they should prepare for a coronation, Theron replied calmly. And if they have concerns about your background or experience, they will keep them to themselves, or answer to me. But to be completely honest with you, Sarah, I don't care what they think. You are my mate. That makes you their future queen, regardless of where you came from. Sarah wanted to argue, but the conviction in his voice and the steady certainty flowing through the bond made her believe he meant every word. All right, she said softly. All right, I'll trust you. Thank you, Theron said, and the gratitude in his voice made her throat tight. Thank you for being brave enough to give this a chance, to give me a chance. I know I'm asking a lot of you. You're asking me to be queen, Sarah said with a slightly hysterical laugh. That's not a lot, that's everything, and I'm terrified I'll fail. Then you'll fail upward with the full support of your mate and your court, Theron said firmly. But I don't think you will fail, Sarah. I think you'll surprise yourself with what you're capable of when you're no longer just trying to survive. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of quiet conversation and comfortable silences, Theron's hand never leaving hers, the mate bond, a constant warm presence between them. They didn't travel to the settlement as originally planned. Instead, Theron redirected their route toward the royal palace, and Sarah felt her anxiety grow with each passing mile. By the time they reached the palace gates, night had fallen, and Sarah's hands were trembling. The palace was massive, a sprawling complex of stone and crystal that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Guards snapped to attention as their carriage passed, and Sarah felt the weight of their curious stares. "Welcome home," Theron said softly as the carriage pulled to a stop. "Welcome to your new home. If you'll have it." Sarah stepped out of the carriage and immediately felt overwhelmed. Staff members were gathered to greet their king's return, all of them trying not to stare too obviously at the unknown Omega at his side. Theron seemed to sense her panic and moved close, his presence a solid, comforting anchor. "Everyone," Theron's voice rang out with unmistakable authority. "This is Sarah Moonwhisper, my true mate. You will treat her with the respect and honor due to your future queen. Any questions about her presence or her background can be addressed to me directly." The staff immediately bowed, murmuring respectful greetings, though Sarah could see the shock and curiosity in their eyes. A true mate bond was rare enough, but finding one after 3 centuries must seem miraculous. "Marcus," Theron continued, "please have the Queen's quarters prepared. Sarah will need a complete wardrobe, and I want a schedule arranged for her to meet with advisors who can begin her education in court matters. But not tonight," he added firmly. "Tonight, she needs rest and recovery." "Of course, my king," Marcus said with a bow, then offered Sarah a warm smile. "My lady, welcome. We are honored by your presence." Theron guided Sarah through corridors that seemed to go on forever, finally stopping at a set of ornate doors. "These are your quarters," he explained. "They connect to mine through that door." He gestured to a side entrance, but the connecting door locks from your side. You control when and if we have access to each other's private spaces. That consideration, That respect for her autonomy even now made Sarah's eyes sting with tears. The rooms were beautiful beyond anything she could have imagined, with a massive bed piled high with soft blankets, elegant furniture, and windows that overlooked moonlit gardens. "It's too much," Sarah whispered. "I don't deserve all this." "You deserve this and more," Theron said firmly. Then he paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Would you like me to stay for a while?" he asked quietly. "Just to talk? To help you settle in? Or would you prefer time alone to process everything?" "Stay," Sarah found herself saying. "Please stay. I don't want to be alone right now." Relief flashed across Theron's face, and he guided her to a comfortable sofa near the windows. They sat close, but not touching, and Sarah felt the mate bond stretching between them, wanting to pull them closer. "Tell me about yourself," Sarah said softly. "Real things, not the official king things that everyone knows. Tell me who you are when you're not being the Alpha King." Theron was quiet for a moment, then began speaking. "I was born during a time of war," he said slowly. "The territories were fractured, different packs fighting for dominance. I was trained as a warrior from childhood, expected to fight and kill and never question orders. By the time I was 30, I had more blood on my hands than I could count." Sarah listened, feeling his pain through the bond. "The wars eventually ended with my pack victorious, and I was crowned Alpha King, more through might than any real desire to rule. For the first century, I was more warlord than king, maintaining peace through fear and strength. But over time, I realized that ruling through fear creates resentment, not loyalty. I started changing policies, trying to unite rather than dominate. It wasn't easy, and many of the old guard resisted, but eventually we created the system we have now, unified territories with a central ruling body but individual pack autonomy." "What changed you?" Sarah asked. "From warlord to the king you are now." "Exhaustion," Theron admitted, "and loneliness. You can only fight and kill and intimidate for so long before you realize you're completely alone. No one saw me as anything beyond a weapon or a tyrant. No one cared about who I was beneath the crown. And I started to wonder what the point of living for centuries was if I was going to spend them isolated and feared." Sarah found herself reaching for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "I understand that," she said quietly. "The loneliness of being seen only for one thing, of never being valued for who you actually are." "Exactly," Theron said, squeezing her hand gently, "which is why finding you feels like the moon goddess finally took pity on me. You see me as just Theron, not the Alpha King. You challenge me and question me and aren't afraid to be honest with me. Do you know how rare that is?" "I thought I was being disrespectful," Sarah admitted. "You are being real," Theron corrected. "That's worth more to me than all the bowing and titles combined." They talked through the night, sharing stories and fears and dreams, the mate bond growing stronger with each passing hour. Sarah learned that Theron loved to read, that he had a passion for architecture, and had designed much of the current palace himself, that he had a wry sense of humor hidden beneath his serious exterior. Theron learned that Sarah loved working with plants and herbs, that she had a gift for healing, that she sang when she thought no one could hear her. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah realized she was happy. For the first time in months, possibly years, she felt genuinely happy. This male, this impossibly powerful and unexpectedly vulnerable king, was her mate. And against all odds, he wanted her. "I should let you rest," Theron said reluctantly as the sun fully rose. "You must be exhausted." Sarah was exhausted, but she was also reluctant to let him leave. "Stay a little longer," she found herself asking, "just until I fall asleep. I don't want to wake up alone and think this was all a dream." Theron's expression softened. "All right, I'll stay as long as you need." Sarah curled up on the sofa, her head resting against Theron's shoulder, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced before. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was Theron's hand gently stroking her hair, and his voice, soft and full of wonder, whispering, "My mate, my perfect, brave, beautiful mate." The next weeks passed in a blur of lessons and meetings and slow, careful courtship. Theron kept his promise to let Sarah set the pace, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They spent hours together each day, talking and learning each other, the mate bond growing stronger and more undeniable with each passing moment. Sarah met with advisors who patiently taught her about pack politics and court etiquette. She studied the history of the territories and learned the complex web of alliances and agreements that kept peace. It was overwhelming at times, but Theron was always there to support her, to answer questions, to reassure her that she was doing well. The court's reaction to her presence was mixed at first. Some wolves were openly skeptical that a rogue Omega could become their queen. But Theron dealt with any disrespect swiftly and firmly, making it clear that insulting Sarah was not acceptable. And gradually, as the court saw how Theron looked at her, how the mate bond was obviously real and powerful, acceptance began to grow. One evening, 3 weeks after Sarah's arrival at the palace, she and Theron were walking through the gardens when she finally voiced something that had been bothering her. "I saw Callum yesterday," she said quietly. Theron stiffened slightly. "He's here? In the palace?" "He came with a delegation from the Silverpine Pack," Sarah explained. "He didn't recognize me at first, dressed as I was in court finery. But when he realized who I was, the look on his face," she paused, trying to find words for the complex emotions. It was shock and disbelief and maybe regret. "What did he say?" Theron asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Sarah could feel possessive jealousy through the bond. "He apologized," Sarah said he had made a mistake in rejecting me, that he hadn't realized what he was giving up. He asked if there was any chance I would consider giving him another chance." Theron stopped walking, turning to face her with eyes that blazed with alpha dominance. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him no," Sarah said simply. "I told him that I had found my true mate, that I was exactly where I was meant to be, and that his rejection was the best thing that ever happened to me because it led me here, to you." The possessive jealousy in the bond eased, replaced by fierce pride and satisfaction. "Good," Theron said, "because you are mine, Sarah, my mate, my queen, my everything, and I am never letting you go." "I don't want you to let me go," Sarah said softly, and realized she meant it completely. "I choose this. I choose you. I choose us." That evening, Sarah made her decision. She found Theron in his study, working through diplomatic correspondence, and closed the door firmly behind her. "I'm ready," she announced. Theron looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "Ready for what?" "To accept the bond," Sarah said, moving toward him with more confidence than she had felt in months. "Completely. To be your mate in truth, not just in declaration, to stop being afraid and start living." "Are you certain?" Theron asked, rising from his desk but making no move to close the distance between them. "Sarah, you don't have to rush this. We can take more time." "I don't want more time," Sarah interrupted. "I want you. I want this life. I want to stop holding back out of fear and start embracing what the moon goddess gave us. I love you, Theron. I don't think I was supposed to fall in love this quickly, but I have. And I'm ready to claim you as completely as you've claimed me." The look on Theron's face was pure joy and hunger and reverence all mixed together. "Say that again," he demanded, his voice rough. "I love you," Sarah repeated, closing the distance between them. "I love you, and I'm yours, and I want everyone to know it." Theron kissed her then, deep and claiming and full of weeks of restrained desire. The mate bond blazed between them, golden and unbreakable, finally accepted fully by both parties. Mine, Theron growled against her lips. My mate, my queen, my love, yours, Sarah agreed breathlessly. Always yours. And I'm never going to doubt my worth again, because you've shown me exactly how valuable I am. The mating ceremony was held a week later, a grand affair attended by representatives from every pack in the territories. Sarah stood before the gathered crowd, no longer the broken, rejected Omega, who had wandered alone, but a confident queen who had found her true mate and her true purpose. When Theron placed the crown on her head and proclaimed her his mate and queen, before all witnesses, Sarah felt nothing but joy. The rejected Omega, who had once believed herself worthless, now stood as the most powerful female in all the territories, loved completely by a mate who saw her true value. And as they stood together before their people, hands joined and mate bond shining bright between them, Sarah finally understood what her grandmother had tried to teach her. Being soft wasn't weakness. Being vulnerable wasn't failure. And being rejected by the wrong wolf had been necessary to bring her to the right one. She was Queen Sarah Nightshade now, true mate to the Alpha King, and she had never been more herself or more loved. The rejected Omega had found her happy ending, and it was better than any dream she had ever dared to imagine.